for YouTube in any case. It's crooked, but that's not my fault. We're talking about historical veracity, and the point of that is that, this doesn't work anyway. When you study any historical documents, and this is not, I don't do theology or doctrines, so this is not about the Bible, it's not about necessarily biblical documents, it's about the Acts of the Apostles, the Acts. Because that's a Greek document, and I do Greek, ancient Greek. Don't ask me to speak modern Greek, I don't do that, but I'll speak to you in German, that'll work, or English. But what you have to do is your professor or professorette should have gone back for every document they use to prove or use in a class to prove the veracity of that document. Because otherwise, if you can't prove the historical veracity of it, then what good is it? Why study it as history, right? Now, of course, you have an interest if you're from a church or if you're Christian based or whatever, and I am, I'll say that. Even if you're secular in your mindset, or Jewish, or Muslim, I don't care. Your interest should be in, well, these crazy Christians have these documents, right? Well, can you prove their veracity? Do they have any veracity? Don't you ask yourself that question? When you're in Sunday school, or when your pastor's preaching, or if you happen to go to some church or another? Wouldn't you ask yourself the question, well, this guy's teaching about Acts. Does it have any veracity? Now, I'm a historian, so I don't have to prove anything to you except for the history, right? So I'm not trying to influence your thoughts necessarily. I'm just trying to show you historically what we know. And it's very interesting because we know quite a lot. Let's talk a little bit. I always like to do Greek words of the day. And so let's talk about Bible versus New Testament, Old Testament documents. As I've told people, you can't get in trouble if you have a collection of Old Testament, New Testament documents on your desk, but some people get upset if you have a Holy Bible on your desk, right? So take your collection of Old Testament, New Testament documents with you, and after this class, you'll know the historical veracity, at least of the New Testament, so you can use that. Now, the problem is that biblios does not mean what we think it means. Biblios is a Greek word that means the inner part of a papyrus plant, literally a paper sheet made of papyrus. It doesn't mean a collection of works. That's an English translation, which I think comes out of the Latin, but I don't do Latin, I do Greek, okay? So in a Greek, a biblios is a piece of papyrus, and most people don't have biblios, don't have papyrus, right? They might have a Bible, but it's not a papyrus, I hope, because it's really hard to write and print on that stuff. To us, a Bible is a collection of historical works. That's generally what we call a Bible. The Holy Bible is, right, the collection of Old Testament, New Testament works. So that's why in all of my classes, you always hear me refer to the documents as the Old Testament, the New Testament, or the apocryphal documents. Although, if you were in my apocryphal class, you know I don't like to separate the apocryphal from the Old Testament. That's okay. In any case, let's see what we have here. These are the words of the day, and the reason I want to mention them to you is because these words have, and this is, let's see, how many we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are 6 of the words for love and like, translated love and like in English from Greek. That's a problem. This is a problem in Greek. Is that when we translate these words into English, we translate them as love and like. But I listed 6, there's actually 8 to 10, depending on how you're counting, words in Greek that mean love or like. And the problem is most of us don't understand what they really mean. For example, you've probably heard over and over again about agape, right? Agape love. I'm sure you've heard that. Did you know that agape love, according to the Greeks, cannot be applied to human beings? It is a Greek sacred word. It is only applied to the love of the gods. Whenever you read this word in your translation, you'll never know if it's this word, or pathos, or phileo, or epithumia, or sturgion, because English doesn't tell you. You have to see the Greek to know. Or you have to be in one of my classes, because this is one of the things I always look for. These are key words, right? For example, I'll give you a great example. Do you remember Peter and Jesus at the end of John? And Jesus tells Peter, feed my sheep, and asks him, do you agape me? And Peter says, I phileo you. Phileo is a brotherly love. And really, brotherly love is not the right word for it. The Greeks are a Beta culture. A Beta culture, Beta is an English word. I love this stuff because this ties so much into English and Anglo-Saxon. But an Anglo-Saxon culture is also a Beta culture. You say, what's a Beta culture? In a Beta culture, the most important person in your life is your shield warrior. In Anglo-Saxon, that person was called your shield bruder, sköldbruder, your shield brother. The same thing is true in Greek, ancient Greek. So it's a Beta culture. In other words, by the way, you know how we say I and me, and you, and him and her, right? First, second, and third person. Did you know there is another pronoun person in Greek, ancient Greek, and in Anglo-Saxon? In Anglo-Saxon, it's called Beta. So when I talk about one, I talk about I, right? When I talk in the second person about you, I talk about you, and then him, her, and it, right? In a Beta culture, you have a pronoun for two people together. Because why? You and your sköldbrother. You and the warrior that is your warrior friend. And between you two is phileo. It's more than what you think. Phileo means that you would give your life for that person. It's not between a man and a woman. It's between two shield brothers, people who defend each other. This is really an important concept in the Greek and a very important concept in Anglo-Saxon. And by the way, anybody remember, I've mentioned before, the pronoun that's still used, the word that is still left in English that refers to this relationship or this pronoun? Both. Both means two. It's Anglo-Saxon. It's the last remaining Beta pronoun that we have. But that's the kind of culture that English speakers come out of. So, Christ asks Peter, do you agape me? And he correctly answers, no, I phileo you, because he sees him as a very strong friend in the Greek sense. And guess what? A human can't agape. He asks him this 3 times, and each time he answers the same way. Another beautiful word, and I mentioned this word last week, epithumia, translated desire, lust, translated love, depends on the Bible, but in King James it's translated desire, lust. It means lust as in deutsches Lust. Deutsche Lust means I want something, I have a great desire for something. But epithumia, I told you, is my favorite words, and I just have to mention this. Epithumia means literally the scent of the sacrifice. Because remember what I told you last week? That in the ancient world, people didn't get to eat meat very often. They only ate meat, in Athens, they ate meat at least 10 times a year because they had 10 festivals. So at each festival, they ate meat once a month. In Israel, they probably ate meat, they might have eaten meat as many as 6 times a year because they had the 6 festivals, remember, and they added a few. But they had the 3 pilgrim festivals and the 3 non-pilgrim festivals. So they had 6 festivals. They might have eaten meat at least 6 times a year. But I tried to get you to the point of understanding that in ancient agrarian cultures, guess what? Meat was not ubiquitous, and people did not eat meat very often. And so therefore, one of the words in Greek for love is epithumia, meaning the scent of the sacrifice. What a powerful word. And whenever you see that word in Greek, guess what a Greek speaker thinks? A ancient Greek person thinks. The scent of the sacrifice. Makes them salivate. And then, of course, my other favorite word, meta-epithumia, translated sometimes pleasure, but means literally the infinite line of the scent of the sacrifice from man to God. Wow. see what you're missing? This is a problem. Sturgeon means parental love. It's not in the King James. It's not in any of the Bibles. Sturgeon is not. Eros is not. Eros does not mean erotic love. That's pathos. Pathos is in the New Testament documents. Pathos means erotic love, what we consider passionate love. Because guess what? Men and women in a marriage, what kind of love do you think they had in ancient Greek culture? The only kind of love you'll find in that is pathos and eros, maybe eros. Because if you know anything about Greek culture, the eros was sometimes reserved for men and boys and whores, prostitutes, because it's their culture. So you would never phileo a woman. What changed all this? Why does our culture, what changed in the culture, what changed in Anglo-Saxon culture from a Beta culture like the Greeks to a culture where women, for example, are held in very high esteem as the most important creatures on earth? Christianity, and mainly the Jewish influence within both the English culture through Christianity and in the Greek culture. Because the Greek culture does this. But like a Jewish culture, where are women on the scale in an Orthodox Jewish culture? Pretty low, right? The Orthodox Jew prays today that, thank you, God, that I was not born a woman. It's one of the blessings he prays every morning. I'm not kidding you. Look at the Jewish, Orthodox Jewish handbook. We'll tell you this. And there is such a thing. I'm not kidding you. But the big point that I'm trying to make to you is that the change was not because of Judaism, and the change was not because of the Greeks. The change was because in Western civilization, Christianity became the forefront. And in Christianity, guess what Christians are supposed to have? Agape love, right? Love like the gods, which humans can't have, which gives them inspiration. And by the way, we know where all the love for women came from, right? You guys know where that came from. You had to study that. In the medieval period, remember what the love the knights had for the courtly ladies? Courtly love. Courtly love is what drove this. So that's the reason we think about love and people the way we do today. Do you remember Arthur and Lancelot? That was a Beta couple. But who did they end up loving more? Guinevere. Guinevere. This is a parable for our times. Well, parable for the ancient times. In any case. So, let's talk about this. How can you prove history? Because that's the point. If we want to prove veracity, and if you've heard this before from me, okie doke, that's the way it goes. Because you know what? We got to prove this before we get to the next point. The next point is actually using the document, that is Acts, to prove the points we're going to make. That is historical points, right? So if Acts is not a historical document, what should we do? Yeah, pack up and go home, find another book, right? But what I want to show you is that it has historical veracity. So therefore, how do we prove historical veracity? How can you prove history? So I asked you, pick somebody. Pick somebody in history that rock and roll knows really existed. Pick somebody.
Gandhi.
Who?
Gandhi.
Gandhi. How do you know Gandhi existed?
Saw him.
There you go. You actually saw Gandhi personally?
Eyewitness.
Well, if he's an eyewitness, that's cool. How about pick somebody that nobody here could have seen? Well, I hope nobody here could have seen. Pick somebody.
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great. How do you know Alexander the Great existed? You're just trusting, right? I'm going to show you how we know these people exist. So let's do it. Let's do it. What's the proof? Let's talk about this. Most of the time we hear this argument. You hear this argument all the time, right? About you can't prove history because it doesn't match the scientific method. Have you heard that before? Anybody heard that? Right? You can't prove this or that because it doesn't match the scientific method. I'm going to tell you a secret. The scientific method can only be used to prove things that are repeatable. If it's not repeatable, you never, ever can use a scientific method to prove it. Okay? Here's an example. If I take these keys and I drop them, I can measure their acceleration and velocity, right? Every time I drop them from the same height, what should I get?
Same results.
Well, similar results. They'll never be the same, right? In the real world, they'll never be the same. But if I keep dropping these, eventually I'll get a median and a mean, right? An average for acceleration and velocity and all this other good data, right? Remember that from school. But I got to keep repeating it, correct? That's scientific method. So, can I prove anything in history using the scientific method?
No.
Never. Why? Doesn't repeat itself, does it? Ever. Does history ever really repeat itself? I mean, we love to say history repeats itself, but does it ever? I mean, do you see Alexander the Great walking down the street? No. Right? History never repeats itself. You can't regain a moment of time. So you have to use a different method. You can't use a scientific method unless you want to test repeatable events. Now, you know, I'm gonna give a little caveat here, because guess what? We can use dating, like carbon dating and iridium dating and potassium dating methods to date things, right? But why can't I use the scientific methods or principles to do that? Because
Original documents are still around.
well, I can use it because I can repeat it, right?
Yeah.
Like I can go and check something that's old and prove that the carbon dating works on something that I know is 20,000 years old or 10,000 or whatever years old, right? And then I go and I take something from the modern era and I can do repeated tests on that document, you know, the Shroud of Turin or, you know, whatever, some manuscript or you know, a piece of, you know, whatever. I can prove things because I can use scientific principles and scientific methods on certain types of things, right? But what does that do? Does that prove history?
No, you'd have to have somebody writing it.
Well, it simply supports history. And you're right, you have to have somebody write it down, right? That's, that, in my, matter of fact, as a scientist, I'm a scientist, so when I do a scientific experiment, what do? I write it down, the results, right? And that becomes part of the legal historical evidence. And that's why you do it. This is the only way to prove history, is what we call the legal historical method. Very effective method because we use this method to put people in jail. We use this method to kill people, to execute them. Pretty effective? Well, you hope it's very effective and efficient, right? But in any case, we also call this method the evidence witness method. And if you're a lawyer, guess what you were taught when you were in school? This method. It may have been called legal historical. Legal historical has become a catch-all phrase for this method, although they've used other terms in the past. You know, evidence witness is one. But in any case, when we do a legal historical method test, what we look at is oral, written, exhibits, and examples. So, for example, an eyewitness account, your oral eyewitness account, we could use that, right, of Gandhi. Or we could use a written book about Gandhi. We can use exhibits, that is, show me Gandhi's robe. You know, he was a jaundice, so he wasn't supposed to have any robes, but he did wear some sometimes, I know from the camera. You have pictures, right, etc., etc. So I can use those items to use legal historical proof. That's the legal historical method. And guess what? The same methods we use in a court of law are the same methods we use in a legal historical method. That's the way it works. There's also another method, but I don't want to confuse you. It's called logic. And logic uses mathematical principles, but it's a different kind of thing. In any case, if we want to use the legal historical method on documents in antiquity, and that's what we're talking about, right? Acts is an ancient Greek document, right? So if we want to prove that the document is verifiable, that it has veracity, what should we do? we apply the legal historical method, right? Pretty easy. Guess what? We can do it. There are 3 tests. There are 3 tests we use called the bibliographical test, the internal test, and the external test. If a work passes all 3 tests, that source is considered indisputable unless it's contradicted by a source of greater degree or merit. You gotta have, if you want to contradict a source, you gotta have another source of greater degree or merit. But you know this. Anybody read Lives? What's it? Is it Pliny? No, who is it? Who wrote the Lives? Back in the Latin period. Plutarch. Anybody read Plutarch's Lives? Come on, everybody's got to read Plutarch. I mean, if you study Latin, you got to read some Plutarch and Ovid. Plutarch's Lives. Plutarch is a has some pretty neat stuff that he put together, glommed together. He glommed it together. It's really interesting stuff. I mean, in it, there's like all kinds of miracles happening and all this other kind of stuff. It's a Roman document. You don't hear much about these miracles, but if you ever read it in Latin, you'll find, man, there's miracles going on all over the place. The pharaohs do miracles, and the Caesar does miracles, and all these miracles are happening because of the gods, the Roman gods. Guess what? He's a tertiary source. I'm going to talk about sources. And there are other books with better degree or merit that also talk about the miracles, but that's okay. I'm just telling you that that's what you look for, is if you have a document in time, you look for something to contradict it, only contradict it if you have something of a better degree or merit. So what's degree or merit? Let's talk about this. Merit refers to how well the work passes the 3 evidentiary tests. So if you pass those 3 evidentiary tests really well, you have high merit. High merit. So guess what? Plutarch passes some of those evidentiary tests pretty well, but in general, the degree is very low. Let's talk about degree. We talked about primary, secondary, tertiary, and I like to say quaternary, but there's really another degree that's none. We call none. Primary is firsthand. So if I'm an eyewitness to something, I'm a primary witness. That document is considered primary. Okay? A secondary, for example, let's take Abraham Lincoln's a great example. Abraham Lincoln was sitting in a booth, and Wilkes Booth shot him, right? And right next to him was his wife. That is Abraham Lincoln's wife. Abraham Lincoln's wife is a primary witness. So if she wrote something down, she is a primary witness to the assassination of Lincoln. Booth is a primary witness, right? Now, when she walks out of the theater and she's accosted by some newspaper writer, and he writes down her account, that is what kind of a witness? That is a secondary witness. And by the way, in a court of law, what do we call that kind of witness?
Hearsay.
That is hearsay. That is hearsay in a court of law. Now, in the ancient world, we do a lot with secondary sources. Because why? We got a newspaper industry, right? Unfortunately, newspaper only goes back as far as newspapers and some other accounts. So very, secondary is pretty important, but not a whole lot. Tertiary is a non-witness. And guess what? Most every history book you pick up is what kind of witness? Tertiary. Matter of fact, what's his name? Plutarch's tertiary witness to almost everything. Josephus is a tertiary witness to almost everything. He never saw it. Most of the witnesses in antiquity are, guess what? Tertiary. Herodotus is a tertiary witness in general. I mean, there are some things where he's a primary, sometimes he's a secondary source witness, but in general he's a tertiary witness. Theodocles, the other great inventor of history in Greek, is guess what kind of witness? Tertiary witness. So everything that we know that happened with Xerxes and the 300, by the way, there were 1,000 Medians, I think, and I think it's Medians. Anyway, there are Thebans. There's 1,000 Thebans and 300 Spartans. Now, why do the Spartans get all the credit? You know, because it was written by a Spartan. Right. So, you know, the big deal here is, you know, that's not a primary source, but guess what? Everybody assumes, right? In any case. So, merit. If I have a document that passes all three tests really well, that's high merit, and we grade them based on merit. So the higher the merit, the more acceptable, right? And if a document contradicts another, if it has high merit, that's good. But also, degree of witness. So if I have a very high merit tertiary witness and a primary witness that's not very good of merit, which one am I going to pick? Always primary. Because eyewitness is critical. Now, you know, I want to point out something to you. Well, let's see. Where do we go get here? How many have heard of these tests and these methods outside of this class? Anybody? Have you? Good, good. Because that's a positive. In general, the biggest problem I have in especially our universities is the universities do not teach this method anymore. They used to teach this all the time. This used to be taught before the turn of the 20th century. This was the primary means of learning. This was primarily what you would get if you went into your classes, okay? In the modern era, this has gone away. Anybody want to venture a guess why? You don't have to now. We'll get to it. In any case, the first test that we apply to a document is called the bibliographical test. The bibliographical test is the examination of how it was transmitted to us in time. How it was transmitted to us in time means how many manuscripts do I have? Now, and secondarily, the time between the original and the earliest manuscript we have. So let that sink in. How many manuscripts, the number of manuscripts, because the more number, the better, right? If I only have one, I only, you know, manuscript, a copy, that's what they are, because I'm going to get to that. I don't know whether I have the true document, right? And secondarily, if there's a lot of time between the original is written and the document I have, right? What's happened in between? It's been copied and copied and copied and copied, right? So I don't know if I have a good manuscript or not. So if I have a very light lapse, we call it lapse time, and if I have a lot of manuscripts, I'm happy. That's happiness. I'm going to show you more of this. The first thing you've got to know is this. No originals from any work in antiquity exist. Remember I told you antiquity is about 600 AD? There are no originals that we know of right now yet of any work in antiquity. I'm talking about Caesar and Pliny and Plutarch and the Old Testament works and the New Testament works. I don't care what you're talking about. Anything before 600 AD, we do not have any of the originals that we know of. Do not. Manuscripts, by definition, are all copied by hand. They're hand copied. So you got some scribe, a grammateus sitting there, or a monk, or a Hebraic scribe sitting there and doing their work by hand. So the problem with that is you can get errors and all kinds of other issues. So again, the number of manuscripts, if I have a whole bunch of manuscripts, I can figure out the errors, right? And if I have a very short lapse rate between the original and the time I have, I can do a lot of work with that. Now let's talk about this. A work with more existing manuscripts is more accurate, a judge should be more accurate, and more manuscripts equals